Okay, welcome everyone to the first NucTalks session of 2025. I want to introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Valeria Gergieva, and I'm a visiting research fellow at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Also, I'm a researcher at the Odesa Center for Nonproliferation and at the Black Sea Women in Nuclear Network. I'm leading their NucTalks initiatives, and actually, as of tomorrow, I will officially assume the role of Vice President of the network. A few words about NucTalks. NucTalks was initiated by the network in August 2022. And since then, we are gathering every 2-3 months to discuss the timely and important topics in the nuclear field. And moving to our topic today, I want to stress why we chose this topic and why it is important to talk about it. So the recent shift in U.S. policy has provoked intense debates about the future of Ukraine, about transatlantic relations, and of course the global order. This information from Trump's sides combined with U.S. conditions for Ukraine appears to be more in favor to Russia, and demands for access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, repayment for previous aid, and even a regime change, along with pressuring Ukraine to abandon its NATO aspirations, also seems more like a surrender strategy than negotiation process. And at the same time, the U.S. Russia talks in Saudi Arabia have raised also serious concerns about Ukraine's exclusion from the table, from the process. But moreover, I would say that also the EU was excluded as well, which also gives us a lot of concern regarding this issue. And because EU, despite being a key supporter of Ukraine and due to the logical, I guess, assumption that given its critical role in Ukraine's defense and reconstruction, and Europe must have a voice in any negotiations shaping the region's future. And today we have the privilege of hosting 3 outstanding experts who will help us to understand this present reality better and current challenges. This is Dr. Polina Sinovets, Dr. Ulrich Kühn, and Dr. Stefan Herzog. Today we will refer to all the important questions regarding the current crisis, and each speaker will have 4-5 minutes to reflect the current situation and potential challenges arising from today's political shifts. The insights will provide perspectives from Ukraine, Europe, and the US, helping us better to understand the nowadays political shift landscape. And after the first speaker's input, I will continue with some questions from myself to the all speakers, and then I will open the floor for audience engagement. And of course, I encourage everyone to participate in the Q&A session by submitting questions in the chat if you can't open your camera while asking the question. And we, of course, will try to address as many questions as possible. And let me introduce the first speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. This is the first speaker is Dr. Polina Sinovets. She's the founder and head of the Odesa Center for Nonproliferation. Currently, she is working as a visiting researcher at Istituto Affari Internazionali, combining it with her continuing work as a senior lecturer at Odessa I Mechnikov National University. I will send like more broader bio to the chat of Polina. So please, Polina, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Valeria. One moment. Could you please send one common friend link for the registration because she missed it? I mean, I'm telling about my daughter. This is why, you know, it's kind of important. Anyway.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, this is a moment when, you know, all bad dreams are coming true. You know, everyone knows my phobia for kind of very irrational phobia on some points of view to meet a shark in the ocean. So I had a dream. I was chased by the shark, and then I saw the safe island, and then I was trying to get to the safe island, and suddenly it turned into a shark, which tried to eat me as well. So this is kind of what Ukraine is feeling at the moment. Yeah, so just a couple of months ago, Ukraine was, it looked like we're in the one boat with, of course, with Europe, we're still in one boat, but also with the United States, We were fighting for the values of democracy. We were considering not at the moment, but still NATO membership. There was a principle, no negotiations on the war against Ukraine without Ukraine. Putin was considered to be a war criminal. So now Trump is shaking hand to Putin. Now we're guaranteed to be not a member of NATO, maybe for sure and for good. And also there are a lot of negotiations behind the back of Ukraine. And the only thing actually which is interesting in Ukraine for Trump, this is this precious mineral deal, which when rejected by Zelensky in its initial form, provoked great indignation from the side of the US administration. And we know the famous tweet of Trump saying that Zelensky is a dictator, and other absolutely irrelevant things, up to the idea that we owe the United States $500 billion for our support during all these years. I don't know for good or for bad, but maybe this is not the question, because now we don't have the choice to sign or not to sign the deal, and it's gonna be signed today, as I understand. We're signing the deal, and the only positive things which we can imagine about this deal is the fact that it still guarantees certain involvement of the United States, at least commercial involvement and business interests of Trump. And as far as the US president is a 100% businessman and not a politician, he's probably going to be, this is the language he understands, the language of money. Also, the fact that the United States mentioned that it is interested in a free and independent and sovereign Ukraine in the deal was a big support to our Ukrainian authorities, which I don't think really matters for Americans. And also the fact that now there is no number of 500 billion in the deal text is also warming their hearts. However, you know, as far as our time is quite short, and maybe we can discuss the deal later, I just want to say that there are about 3 scenarios of events development regarding Ukraine and the future of the war. The optimistic, the pessimistic, and the realistic one. The optimistic one is something about the long-lasting peace. The deal is signed, the precious minerals are extracted all together with the US and the United States. Europeans are sending their peaceful troops at the territory of peaceful Ukraine, where there is no war. Putin, for some reason, is happy and also having no ambitions for the other part of the territory of Ukraine. However, those who know the situation at the ground can imagine that, you know, this is, you should drink a lot to believe that it may come true easily. The other scenario, which is super pessimistic, is that at the end the deal would not come true, that Trump would be somehow, not somehow actually, the withdrawal from Europe is declared, so the United States is just withdrawn from Europe, just abandoning Ukraine. Ukraine is face to face with Russia because Russia is absolutely unhappy with any peace conditions it is suggested. And there are a lot of signs to believe that Putin would not be satisfied with the suggestions, even current suggestions from Trump, though he's pleasing him very much these days. And if he won't be satisfied, because he still wants all Ukraine, all Novorossiya, and minimum Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk Oblast fully, not only up to the line of control. And also the declaration that they were never going to step away from the principle of take the full Novorossiya, which is also Mykolaiv and Odesa. Gives the idea that Russia may not accept these conditions and go on with the war. But in this situation, there will be only Ukraine against Russia, supported by Europeans. And the question is for how long there will be enough money, for how long there will be enough patience of European states support Ukraine, and whether Russia won't get the maximum result from it. And the last, more or less realistic, is the fact that maybe the deal will be signed, will be probably signed today. However, the implementation of the deal is not that easy because most of these precious metals are at the territory of the occupied by Russia now. So Russia has its own deal suggested to the United States to extract these minerals from their side. And there is the idea that Trump might be just tired of these negotiations, just leave. However, not completely abandoning Ukraine and Europe, but reducing the US help in 2, 3, 5 times. So it will be just a little bit of the US help, the war going on. Europeans will have to be involved more. And yeah, nobody knows what will be the result at the end. Thank you very much for listening my optimistic presentation.
Thank you very much, Polina. We will move to the next speakers, and then we will have a discussion regarding all this issue, and we'll maybe also try to form some kind of pessimistic, optimistic, and realistic approach. So let's move to the second speaker. This is Dr. Ulrich Kühn, head of the research area on arms control and emerging technologies at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. Please, Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Val, and also thanks to Polina and for Stephen. Thanks for having me here. I try to keep it short. I have basically 4 key messages that I want to focus on. The first message is we are on our own, meaning Europe is now on its own. And whenever I speak of Europe, today in this short presentation first, but also in the discussion later, that particularly includes Ukraine. So I'm not separating between Europe here and Ukraine. When I speak of Europe, it includes Ukraine. So why are we on our own? Well, Europe is surrounded by 3 at least partially hostile powers. There is clearly Russia threatening us with war and conducting war against Ukraine. There is the US now threatening our democracies. And there's China that is threatening our economic model. And that means that at the moment, we will need different strategies to answer these threats. So I'm not an economist, and I'm also not a researcher on different domestic power models, but I'm an expert on defense issues. So I will focus on defense. And what I described, that Europe is surrounded by 3 partially hostile powers, means that we need to arm. And we need to spend big time on defense. And that means that the country where I come from, where I live, Germany, will have to change its policies in that regard. It will have to take on much more responsibility than it did previously. And the new or likely next chancellor, Friedrich Merz from the Conservatives, is already going in that direction. However, it's still unclear where the money should come from for all the defense spending that Germany needs to lift in the years ahead, not just for itself, but also for European partners, and in particular for Ukraine. If we fail to do that, then Ukraine will be lost. Moscow will certainly draw the wrong lessons from that win, which it then will perceive as its win. And there are quite some indicators, I would say, that point to that Moldova and then the Baltic states are next on Moscow's menu. And we need to prevent that. Second message. Arms cannot be the only answer to that challenge. What I mean here is that the big arming that Europeans will have to conduct in the next years and perhaps decades must not come at the expense of social cohesion, meaning that we cannot simply invest in defense and say, well, but when it comes to social security services, that's not so important, or the education or the economy, that's not so important. We need to focus on defense. The thing is that we need to spend in a broad way, because otherwise Moscow will indirectly exploit the divisions that will come from that, and we will end up in a place domestically seen where the United States is today. And I don't want to see that happening. That means defense spending needs to be the #1 priority, but we need to make sure that we at the same time spend also in the other areas of responsibility of the state. And that means that we will not only have to spend, but we will have to lend money. And in the case of Germany, for instance, that is a problem, and we can talk about that later on. My third message is that better to have no arms control than what I term harms control. There are quite some indications or early indications that the United States and Russia are looking for areas of common interest and that they have identified arms control and particularly strategic arms control. Some of you here may know that next year, I think in February, the new START agreement will run out. That had been extended for once in the past. And there is no follow-on agreement right now. And perhaps that's something where the United States and Russia can engage on. Good. Well, good for the two of them and also good for the world, because if those two countries decide that they want to launch their nukes at each other, then we're all, excuse my French, not in a good place. But honestly speaking, this kind of arms control will be bad for Europe because it may come on the back of betraying Ukraine and the European allies. And if I, who has been a long time advocate for arms control and for more arms control, if I could decide between having that kind of arms control that, that clearly exploits other countries and that betrays former allies or no arms control, then I would choose no arms control. Last message. There was so much negativity in the last couple of days, at least on this side of the Atlantic, but I read the New York Times is also on the other side of the Atlantic. People, at least when we look at Ukraine, this is my message, we can do this. The European Union is the world's biggest single market in terms of revenue. The EU and Ukraine have together more people than the United States and Russia combined. Germany, despite being in its third year of economic recession, is still the world's third largest economy. Europe can do this. So please don't tell me that there are structural reasons for not going in that direction. We can live up to the challenge, but we need to find ways to channel a political will in the direction that I outlined just now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. And we are moving to our third speaker. And then we'll start to discuss it more detailed. So the third speaker is Dr. Stefan Herzog, Professor of the Practice at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me, Valeria. Also good to see Polina and Uli here, and I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. I just want to be honest from the start that the U.S. perspective, I think, is very much in flux. This is an open conversation, and things that I say right now might not be true later today after we see the results of Zelensky meeting with Trump. But I think that one way of looking at this, that I see it, is that U.S. support for Europe, and especially Ukraine, is now seen as increasingly transactional, and that things that we once thought were true about the U.S. commitment to Europe, I think, are actually on the table to be questioned. I personally do not think that Trump is going to abandon Europe and that Trump would like Russia to swallow Ukraine and doesn't care. I think that Trump is using traditional, what he does, his businessman, almost strongman style diplomacy. And I believe that the pivot toward Putin and Russia and the talks were a way of trying to scare Zelensky and Ukraine to the table in order to get the mineral deal. And I also think that a lot of the exclusion of Europe and tough talk towards Europe is about trying to hike up European defense spending and to get a level of burden sharing that the Trump administration doesn't believe was done by Europe in the past. Unfortunately, I think this type of transactional diplomacy diplomacy does not sit well with allies of the United States and partners of the United States. And I think it's highly likely to backfire and to blow up in the Trump administration's face, honestly. We know that there's been debate over how much aid the United States has provided to Ukraine, between 100 billion, some say, and 500 billion. And in the age of America First and cost cutting, the objective is on getting a deal. And we know that according to records, that Ukraine has 22 of 34 entities that the EU defines as rare earth metals: lithium, graphite, cobalt, large quantities, an estimated 5% of the world's stockpiles, or in US dollar terms, 14.8 trillion. However, my understanding so far regarding the deal which has been signed is that it would only apply to Ukraine's metal wealth, which is in the ground, and not to things that are currently supporting the war effort. And my additional understanding is that close to half or more of the metal wealth that we're talking about is actually in the Donbas, the area in areas occupied by Russia right now. So it's difficult to understand how the United States would get personnel on the ground in order to be able to extract it. And Russia is also now trying to sell the United States these types of metals. So it's unclear what would happen. But I do think what's clear is that the United States is not going to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, or if they do, it will be a vague sentence, such as we saw at the Singapore summit and the declaration between Trump and Kim over the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think it's likely to lead to anything said about security lead to disagreements and misinterpretations over what that actually means. But what we do know is that Zelensky has said that Ukraine will either join NATO or get nuclear weapons. Whether or not that's true, which way it's going to go, the United States has now said that NATO membership is probably off the table for Ukraine, and so are security assurances. I don't believe that Ukraine is going to develop nuclear weapons anytime soon, but I think it's a little bit foreboding. The other thing that the U.S. government has currently said is that they're interested in having arms control potentially with Russia and China simultaneously. This is complicated because China has said that it will never participate in the trilateral format, and the Trump administration recently fired the office which I previously worked in, which does nuclear verification activities, and then rehired them. So it's unclear what sort of personnel they would have for verification of those types of things. I do think we'll get a deal. Trump likes making deals. I think it's likely to be misinterpreted about what it means, and I think that all sides have incentives to sell a deal between Trump and Zelensky as a win. But what I think is interesting is that the Trump administration has said time and time again that they, are supportive of peace, and they've justified departing from their 6 previous UN General Assembly resolutions supporting Ukraine and rejecting that by saying they want peace, and standing with Belarus, the DPRK, and others with not condemning Russian aggression and saying that Russia is responsible, and they say they want a more neutral way to solve the conflict. At the same time, President Trump has said that if Zelensky makes a deal, the United States will provide Ukraine with lots of weapons and the ability to fight on. So whether or not that means there's an actual commitment to peace or it's transactional is up in the air. What I do think is foreboding is I think that unless Europe steps up, as has been talked about by my colleagues, I think on some level, Ukraine is likely to be on its own. I think there's a foreboding position for Europe in general, particularly given Vice President Vance's sentiments at the Munich Security Conference condemning Europe. And I would point to also that I think there are changing ties in Europe as a result of all this. Recent public opinion polls, for example, in the UK, say that it's close to half of Britons say that they support standing with Ukraine, and only 20% say they would prioritize the relationship with the United States over that. So I think there are at least some changing tides in public opinion. But what I do think is going to happen here because of the skepticism is I think that we're likely to see a situation when Uli says that we're on our own, where Europe has to think about its future, where U.S. commitments to the continent are not as clear as they used to be, or the Trump administration is engaging in transactional diplomacy that may backfire. But what I think will be interesting is what does that mean for the nuclear dimension, given the name of this network, and what does that actually mean? And I think what's been fascinating is President Macron and France has recently said that they'd be willing to use the French nuclear arsenal, much smaller, to defend Europe. But, you know, there's a joke that goes around, and that is that when the German government says Germany, they actually mean Europe. And when the French government says Europe, they actually mean France. So we'll have to determine what that is and what the credibility of this type of posturing is. But again, we'll see. And I think it's just interesting to have an open conversation on where things go. I think that the Trump administration right now, I think there's a little bit of method to the madness. I think that they're quite unpredictable and transactional. But I think that that makes it difficult for their friends and historical partners to be able to concretely rely on them or feel like they can trust them.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all panelists, speakers for such interesting start of the conversation. As I told, I would like to start with the questions, and my question is for every speaker, so we can also follow the same line. So we'll start from Polina, then Ulrich, and then Stefan. And I have two questions. I will start from the first one, of course, regarding the security guarantees and also regarding the possible arms control deal. I will start with the first one. So we were talking like about the ceasefire and that this is really optimistic and most probably will happen. However, like as also Stefan told that these negotiations, they not include now any security guarantees, and that the United States are not going to provide Ukraine with any security guarantees. So my question is regarding this. How do you access this? First of all, how do you access a ceasefire where Ukraine appears to be the only side who is making concessions? Also, could be these European or multinational peacekeeping forces some kind of security guarantee? And maybe what kind of security guarantees would be ideal for Ukraine at this initial stage if we had the possibility to have more concessions and to negotiate? And also the last one, there is such a widespread assumption regarding this ceasefire that it would be contemporary and merely giving Russia more time to restore its economy and military capabilities. So if you agree with this concern, and maybe you disagree, because, for example, yesterday Trump was a meeting with the Prime Minister of the UK told that he totally trusts Vladimir Putin. So maybe, yeah. But yeah, if you agree with this concern, what do you think would be a good strategy for Ukraine in Europe to use this time effectively? Ulrich already mentioned that defense spending is the first priority. So maybe we can go further, and maybe our all speakers have also like support this idea of defense, and maybe you have another ideas how to use this time properly and not to lose time. So yes, thank you. Let's start with Polina.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you, colleagues, for your great presentations, and thank you, Uli, for your great words. I appreciate it highly when you're making no borderline between Ukraine and Europe, because very often big friends of Ukraine do this, make this line. Answering on your question, so actually I'm not really believing in the ceasefire, but let's imagine, because for now it looks like Moscow wants just to divide between the development of good relationship with the United States and building their own relationship with the United States and the war. So I think that they just are just interested to detach one from the other, so they can wage war and at the same time build up some relationship with the Trump administration. So ceasefire, yeah, if it happens, then what security guarantee can be the best for Ukraine? I mean, on my point of view, this is still something which is called the tripwire function, and this is something which is connected with the threat to involve Putin in a bigger European conflict with the serious powers. This is why, for me, the presence of European, I don't know, contingents, or let's call them peacekeepers, not to frighten Putin, who is not listening to us, I think. It is indispensable because what Putin understands is only the language of the hard power. And I don't think he's very much interested in the conflict with the two nuclear powers as France and UK. Yes, sure, there is a certain myth in Russia that Europe is weak, that Europe is full of fears. But at the same time, I think that the demonstration of certain cohesion, at least between the strongest European states, and certain resolve to stand with Ukraine, especially physically with troops, would mean something for Putin, at least preventing him from the active actions against Ukraine. If there will be also ceasefire, of course, again, this is quite a fantastic scenario, but we also know that apart from NATO membership, Ukraine also applied for the EU membership. And that in this regard, the best, thing which Europe could show us is the solidarity with Ukraine, and what can be the best solidarity if not accepting Ukraine to European Union. However, we know that there is Hungary, there is Slovakia and European Union, and some others who would probably vote against or abstain. So this is a really hard path. However, you asked me what is the best. I can tell you what is the best, but however, it's not really credible on my point of view now.
Thank you, Uli.
Thank you, Valeria. So first you asked about the ceasefire and concessions. Who needs to make concessions? Well, if you want to have a stable ceasefire, then everyone needs to make some concessions. That's clear. It becomes clear, for instance, when we look at the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region. It's clear there will have to be some concessions in this or that regard. That's the first thing. The second, you asked about what kind of security guarantees. I can give you my reading of where the German government stands on that. The first thing is that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine, and it has been off since a very long time. And by the way, don't put too much trust into NATO, because NATO is a US-led alliance. So the trust should not be there. That's the first thing. Second, I don't know about EU membership, because at the moment everyone focuses on the EU defense clause. But what people forget is that the EU at the beginning was invented, as a peace project focused on the economy. I also see a lot of EU member states at the moment having real headaches imagining including Ukraine into the EU. So here my advice would be, don't listen to the heads of the EU at the moment when it comes to Ukraine. They are not reflecting what most of the capitals in the EU are thinking about potential Ukrainian membership in the EU. So where does that leave Ukraine? Well, it leaves Ukraine with, as I see it at the moment, the only workable strategy, and that is to arm Ukraine to its teeth. And you can call that the porcupine strategy or the Israel model or whatever you want to call it, but it means that Ukraine needs to have a constant high inflow of conventional weaponry, of training and whatnot for the next years and decades ahead. And that will be hundreds of billions. And the US will not pay that. That will be Europeans that are going to pay that. That has to be very, very clear. If we Europeans want to have peace in that war, that's the price that we will have to pay. And it's going to be a very high price tag. Also, by the way, Stephen mentioned this is a talk about nuclear weapons. If we want to prevent Ukraine at some point pursuing the nuclear route, I agree with Stephen. It's not going to be imminent, at least not for the next couple of years, but at some point it might come. So if we want to prevent that nightmare scenario where in Europe we have nuclear-armed Ukraine and nuclear-armed Russia, perhaps involved in an ongoing war, then we better arm Ukraine with conventional weapons. European peacekeeping forces, first of all, I think Moscow won't accept that. Why? Because for Moscow, these are more or less NATO forces. I mean, this is what Russia wanted to prevent since decades. So why should they now agree to that? I just don't get it. Why should they? Okay, let's assume they would. Then what's the purpose of those forces? Is it simply controlling the line of contact? For that, you can have UN peacekeepers. You don't need the Europeans for that. Or is it to prevent renewed Russian attack? Meaning it would have to be a tripwire force. Would that be possible for the Europeans? Yeah, the tripwire, yes. Couple of brigades. I know that the discussions in Berlin are ongoing about how many you would need. The problem at the moment seems to be the rotation, because you would have to rotate in and out fresh forces after a couple of months. So that's more of a problem. But then the big question is, what is that tripwire connected to? What's going to explode if the Russians decide that they want to come again at Ukraine and at those forces? That's the big question that the Europeans cannot answer at the moment. Before you get to the two fingers of Polina, let me just finish that sentence, because that was your last question. When will Russia come back attacking? Well, you know, when it feels that it can without being punished. So we better make sure that if Russia wants to come back, they're going to be punished.
Yeah, 2 fingers from Polina, then mine also 2 fingers.
Yes, this is exactly what I meant. The European peacekeeper just for the tripwire function, and what it will be connected to, I don't know. It will be connected to the national wills of the states, and here the ambiguity is necessary. What we know about Russians, what we know about Putin, and what we know about Russians coming still from canon, which gives me the courage to say that maybe this is something common about Russians always. They never run the risk when they believe that it's not for sure, that it's not safe for sure to attack someone, right? So the European peacekeepers will give this ambiguity. Yes, maybe Europe won't stand for them, but what if yes? What if something happens and then they will face like 2 European powers with nuclear weapons, which can, who knows, do what? I mean, it opens a lot of imaginary scenarios, which can end up not absolutely safely for Moscow. And Putin is not the guy who likes this ambiguity, because for him, the best thing is to take somebody who is weak. When somebody is weak, Putin comes and takes it. Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, Ukraine, nobody had actually the chance to stand, and Ukraine was a big surprise. This is why European peacekeepers needs just to put one more, I would say, layer of concern for Putin. On the things might go not in the way he is expecting, and he's very cautious, he's very rational, he's very thoughtful while doing some things without considerations. And also, Europeans gave Putin very bad example of how things may go after Crimea, right? Very weak sanctions, not really as isolation. So he, starting the war against Ukraine, he was actually thinking the same, that it will end up in the same way. So now he should probably study to know how to respect Europe, and how to see Europe not as the object of the US manipulations and somebody weak sitting under the US umbrella, but the independent hard power actor who has its own will, its own commitments, its own principles ready to stand for. That's it.
Thank you, Polina. A very quick question to Uli. I really like idea to arm Ukraine as much as Europe can. Of course, I'm sure like everyone supports it. But a quick question: do you see signs that Europe is ready to this approach? So, for example, German government will be ready to arm Ukraine much more, like, and to give it priority. So, is it possible in the nearest future?
I think it depends on basically it depends on three factors. The first factor is political will. The second is there enough money? And then is there actually the defense industrial base? On all three fronts, I see movement. I'm most concerned, to be honest, at the defense industrial base at the moment, because we don't have the output at the moment that Ukraine would need if we exclude the US as a weapons supplier. And that's a problem. It's basically a problem on a time scale. I do see movements on the EU and on the German level. We have already talked since 2 days that Germany wants to agree on a new extra budget for defense, which would include Ukraine, which would double the old one. So it's going to be a 200 billion package. That's probably going to be decided by the old German Bundestag, the old parliament, while the new one is coming in. So you see that things are now really moving quickly. That's a little hat tip also to Stephen. You see Trump is unlocking a couple of things. So one could say he is successful, but I'm not so optimistic when it comes to his strategies, whether that's all just a show and then he turns out to be the real transatlanticist guy. I don't think that you said that, Stephen, but sometimes this is what I read in some op-eds in the US. And the last question is what's happening on the European level, and I see a bit of movement here. And I'm concerned because I don't see much movement at the moment, but Euro bonds are being discussed as a way of lending money through all the states and then increase defense spending on a broad scale and scaling that up. But Euro bonds have worked in the past in other areas. We will see whether that's the answer in the defense realm. It's too early to tell.
Thank you so much. We are moving to Stefan, and after this, we will open a floor for the questions from the audience. So please, whether write it in the chat or just raise hand, because we are a bit run out of the time. Yeah, so please, Stefan. Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen people talking about that I don't think is realistic too is, besides a ceasefire, as I've heard people talking about, essentially an agreement for regional containment of the conflict. I think that that would be unlikely to happen because I think the Trump administration has been somewhat clear that they are interested in Russia receiving parts of Ukraine's territory. So I think it's unlikely to see that happen. But I think whether there's a ceasefire, whether there's regional containment of the conflict or something else, it's important to think about concessions. And we consistently hear the Trump administration talk about Ukraine making concessions. And I think that Uli is right that the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region are something. I think Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory are something which could be negotiated over. But I think Trump has also said, too, that Russia will need to make concessions, but it hasn't really been clear what concessions Russia will need to make. I would say that possible concessions that Russia could make would be giving the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant back would be a nice thing that Russia could do. I would say that Russia could contain the conflict as well in the defined area, stop the attacks of Shaheds on Kyiv, and stop, missile launches on Odesa, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to that, I agree in general with my colleagues on some level that I think that Europe rearming, I think that the European defense industry arming Ukraine and something resembling security guarantees from the European context would all probably be good things in the long run. Those would be useful. And I also think that those would help the European rearming and supporting Ukraine with perceived burden sharing with the United States. I'm not ready to call the alliance between the United States and Europe and the partnership with Ukraine as well dead because of the Trump administration's transactional diplomacy so far. But I do know that this whole burden sharing and asking Europe to do a lot is sometimes, I think, not very fair. There are a lot of politicians in the United States who consistently say Europe doesn't pay its fair share, etc. cetera, et cetera. But they also forget the history in which there was an intentional strategy to make Europe dependent upon the American defense industry in the long run. And then they woke up one day and there was a call that Europe needed to do more, et cetera, et cetera. The last comment I'll make in general is I think that all of these things, as mentioned, probably have a good non-proliferation function for Ukraine. But I think if the war has shown us anything in the context of the overall conflict, I think that nuclear weapon threats by Russia have been successful in keeping NATO out of the conflict, but I don't think they've stopped Ukraine. And I think that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, I don't think it would stop Russia. And in order to do that, to have an effect on the conflict, both would need to be willing to make escalatory threats, probably on each other's cities or at a larger level, which are things that, you know, we haven't really seen done credibly so far.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I already see questions from the audience, so please, the first one was Tatiana Melnik, then Ali Alkish. Please introduce yourself very shortly, and yeah, because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm affiliated with the Odesa Center for Nonproliferation and currently working at the European Parliament as an accredited assistant. Just a few comments in the question. The first thing is about the European level of support in the European rise. I'm very happy to see the internal trends, like Kubilius is becoming the commissioner, we've created the SEDE committee full-fledged, and I really see the inspiration and the wish to create something meaningful at the European level and to use the money more effectively. The thing that worries me a lot is, of course, like the trends that and the people and those thoughts that have started being more and more loud when the Trump came to power and started talking about his deal and the concessions. And I will share some of those with you that I've heard recently, and I really hope that over here we have a consensus that are non-realistic in a sense of like never NATO accession, and I think also in line of the promises to Georgia and Ukraine that one day they will be members of NATO. If there is an official stand like that, they will not be, no matter how we trust or do not trust anymore the U.S. security guarantees to NATO would be a step back. Another interesting thing that is a little difficult in the context of that I really love and believe also in army Ukraine was the demand of Russia to no military force in Ukraine that can threaten Russia as a demand and the red line, and that makes it even more difficult. So if it is not NATO, if this is no European forces, and if it is Ukraine disarmed, that makes it just give up. And elections in Ukraine that I technically don't see anyhow feasible in the nearest future. And they say that these are the compromises that they're ready to go. They are ready to go on, and they say, well, we can maybe accept the Ukraine becoming the EU member one day, maybe in 20 years. Because we know that this will, and we will do our best to not make it happen in the nearest future. So the question that I have in this regard is, maybe from your point of views, how can we still bring the narrative back to where it was half a year ago? Also maybe who can be those countries and leaders that can speak up louder and say that these narratives are a no-go and no compromise can be made on Russian conditions? What can we do as Ukraine in order to go through this time of disturbances? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's also hear Ali Alkish question, yeah, and then react.
Thank you, Valeria. Thank you also, Polina, Ulrich, and Stephen, for your insights. They were really great. My question is, as a Turkish citizen, I am curious about how Turkey's efforts in facilitating peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are perceived in Europe and in the US. Given that Turkey has consistently supported Ukraine's territorial integrity since 2014, and considering last week's meeting between the two presidents in Ankara, along with Zelensky's strong support for Turkish mediation following the success of grain deal, I would like to hear your thoughts about Turkish intervention in these peace negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have questions. Who would like to start to answer, to reflect? Polina?
Maybe it is because I don't have too much things to say. What Ukraine can do, I think that Ukraine is not absolutely independent with what it can do, and the grain deal, the precious minerals deal shows that initially Ukraine didn't want to sign it because Ukraine is giving everything in return for almost nothing. However, it looks like there is no way to sign or not to sign. It will be signed anyway, because otherwise Ukraine would use the US support completely and, momentarily. This is why Ukraine now is having very tight hands. Of course, it should go on with fighting against Russia. It should protest diplomatically against any deals behind its back. It should try to involve the United States as much as possible, have negotiations with Europeans, trying not only to demand, but also to accommodate to what Europeans are willing to give now. But there is not much new Ukraine can suggest in the situation when it's just sinking, and probably what is given from outside is the last straw to fight. And also, of course, Ukraine should, if the opportunity appears, and I'm not sure it will, negotiate with Russia and the partners about maximum gains and minimum concessions in the future peace deal. I'm not sure it will work, but still we should do our best to try, at least to give it a try. Answering Ali's question, Ali, before it was considered, the idea that Turkey can be a good mediator between, these negotiations was the fact that US and the Russian presidents were not talking to each other. There were no communications. Now it looks like the US president is so full of love and passion to President Putin that he doesn't need the third participant of that. They can do on their own. And in this regard, I would see more of a Trump as the peace mediator and facilitator of the dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, because he can curse, at least, I don't know whether he can curse Putin, but Putin may have at least imitate the wish to make a peace deal, because I don't still believe he wants. To meet with Zelensky, and only, of course, when the United States would pressure. I don't think that in this regard, I think that if situations were like it was during Biden, Turkey could be really important negotiator, because it managed to keep the good relationship with Russia and also with Ukraine. But now, with such a great honeymoon between Washington and Moscow, I don't think there is any need for Turkey. They can do it on their own.
Thank you, Uli and Steven. Do you have comments on this regard?
Yeah, just very quickly, really very shortly. I think Polina summarized it really well. There is not much that Ukraine can do at the moment, but continue what it's doing, that is fighting the aggressor. That is what Ukraine has to do. There are a couple of steps that have been taken in the last couple of weeks when it comes to reform of the armed forces of Ukraine. I think that's the way to go. There needs to be an impact here when it comes to making sure that there is much more rotation along the front line. Except for that, we will have to wait what comes out of that. I personally believe that we don't get a peace deal. I don't think that Russia is in a position to seek a peace deal, because I think that they can achieve what they want to achieve on the battlefield. And so that should be our focus at the moment, to prevent that from happening. Turkey as an interlocutor, sure. Every country that is serious about being a peace mediator here or serving as a hub for talks is welcome, as long as that includes all the warring parties, period.
Thank you. Steven?
So I would say rather than talking about the front lines, on the question of what do we do to get things back to how they were 6 months ago, as far as essentially moral standards and the belief that Ukraine is a democratic country and should be defended, and that Russia is the aggressor, and what do we do in order to return to that climate and context? And my answer to that is that I think that there are only two possible ways to do this. One is to do it without the United States and this administration, which is a significant European commitment, and let the United States retrench. Or the other way is that if Ukraine is going to directly engage the United States in this type of transactional diplomacy with Trump, they need to make the Americans a better deal than the Russians are willing to do so. And I don't know if the Ukrainian government is willing to do it. The mineral deal will have to be ratified by the parliament. Who knows where this is going? But I think that is the way to, yep, see, shaking the finger, Polina is, that is the way to get the Trump administration on your side, is to win in the transactional diplomacy. And then I think that they'll be supportive and they'll say the correct things. On Turkey as a moderator or a mediator, or its participation in this, I think, I'll echo what my colleagues say, particularly what Polina said on this. From the people in the United States that I've talked to in the government and otherwise, the position generally seems to be, not only do we not need help from a country like Turkey, we don't need the other NATO countries in the room. And what they say is that NATO is a 32 nation alliance and the room would get too crowded, so we should do this directly. Now, that's not really how negotiations work that involve NATO, where you'd have a representative of every country sitting in the room, but that has been made. And the understanding that I'm getting from Washington is that NATO allies are to be consulted after the fact, rather than, for the most part, rather than being participants. And generally that will be done through the Secretary General and through consultations with the heads of larger states. Smaller states in NATO will just find out through the Secretary General, and that appears to be the position. And Polina shook her finger at you.
Yes, please.
Yes. One thing, the deal is made in the way it should not be ratified by Ukrainian parliament to avoid these complications, just because of that concern with Stephen raised, that it might not be ratified and then it will be a collapse of the relationship with the United States. So they took care the deal would not be ratified by the Ukrainian parliament.
You are much more up to date than me.
You have to.
Thank you. We have only 2 minutes left, and I see 2 more questions. So please, Bogdan, if it's a quick question, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Bogdan. I'm affiliated with the Odesa Center for Nonproliferation, and I'm also a fellow at CNS. I have just one comment about the mineral resources deal. As I understood from the text, it's actually like the memorandum of understanding, because it will be more detailed deal, which will be like the next step. And my understanding that now in Washington, Zelensky and Trump, they're just signing like the memo that they're ready to negotiate more detailed deal. This is my understanding. But the second one is, I have the question to Ulrich, if I may. I interested in this what you said about the European defense industrial base and the opportunities for Europe to try to be more independent in defense production and spending. And I just have a question. What is your thoughts about how quick can it be done, for example? Because now, as we see, Europeans, they don't have like they don't have the capacities to produce their own their own weapons, for example, which are very very useful in Ukraine, such as drones, for example. Without the Chinese spare parts or without the American support, they cannot do that. So my question is, do you see it can change like in 5-10 years? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bogdan. Let me just get right back to that. So independence of Europe in terms of defense industrial capacity. Well, Stephen said something quite important when he said there was a deliberate strategy in the US to prevent that from happening, because you might end up with a product in the end, whether it's a drone or a fighter jet or whatever, where you're going to say, oh, that's actually better than the American products. So other countries then, large buyers like India might be like, okay, let's buy European, let's not buy US. So what I'm saying here is that it's difficult. It's not like we cannot do that. I cannot answer your question in terms of giving you clear timelines, because it depends on, look, you pointed to drones. What's perhaps the most advanced country at the moment when it comes to the fast production of battlefield drones? It's probably Ukraine, followed by probably Russia, because this is where the need is at the moment. European drones cannot keep up with that. And by the way, US drones also cannot keep up with that, because it's different kinds of drones involved or developed for different kinds of warfare scenarios, where it now turns out that at a war like the one that we see between Ukraine and Russia, you need quite different types of drones. But let me give you a different example. The European long-range strike asset called ELSA. That's something where Germans, the French, the Brits, the Italians, and the Poles have come together to develop the next generation of cruise missile standard weapons with a range of 1,000 to 1,500. It's classified, but still, this is moving quite quickly, and you can see that happening within a couple of years, less than 5 years. The question then is scale. Can you scale it up, and on what terms? So of course all that can be done, but I fear that it's, or let's put it like this: it's clear the EU or the European states are not the United States. We cannot substitute all of them. And at the moment, it might be good that we cannot do it, because if I look at certain capacities, then those are the kind of capacities that I don't want to be dependent on, aka Starlink.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. Unfortunately, we are run out of time, and we really need to wrap up this very interesting discussion. And please, if you want to continue discussion, we might stay, those who can, our members, maybe for 5 more minutes, but the official part should be finished. And I want to thank all the speakers sincerely for this interesting, insightful meeting. We are very grateful for your time. Thank you for accepting this invitation. And of course, many thanks for everyone who joined and who asked questions. And of course, to the Black Sea Women in Nuclear Network for this initiative and support. And we look forward to continue these important discussions in the future. Thank you. Recording stopped.